When people think of World War II tank warfare, they often picture German Blitzkrieg, Soviet armored breakthroughs, or American Sherman tanks. Japanese tanks rarely received the same attention, leading to the common belief that Japan simply had poor tanks and little understanding of armored warfare. However, the reality is far more complex. Japanese armored doctrine was shaped by unique geographic, industrial, and strategic circumstances. Rather than viewing tanks as independent instruments of decisive battlefield action, the Imperial Japanese Army developed a philosophy that placed tanks in close cooperation with infantry while envisioning larger armored operations under the right conditions. Understanding Japanese tank philosophy requires looking beyond the tanks themselves and examining how Japanese military leaders believed armed forces should be used in battle. Japan was actually one of the first and earliest adopters of armored warfare outside of Europe and North America. During the interwar period, Japan imported British and French tanks and studied the lessons of World War I before developing its own indigenous designs. By 1940, Japan possessed the fifth largest tank force in the world and had introduced innovations such as diesel-powered tanks long before many Western nations adopted them. Japanese tank units played a significant role in the early victories in China, Malaya, and the Philippines, helping to demonstrate the value of mobility and armored support in offensive operations. These experiences shaped a interesting doctrine that emphasized speed, mobility, and cooperation with infantry rather than heavily armored breakthrough vehicles. Unlike Germany, which was preparing for large mechanized wars across Europe, Japan's military focus was largely centered on China and the rugged terrain of Asia, where roads were poor and opportunities for large-scale tank battles were limited. At the heart of Japanese tank philosophy was an almost complete emphasis on the offensive. Japanese doctrine viewed defense as merely a temporary necessity before launching a counterattack. Tanks were therefore considered offensive weapons whose purpose was to create momentum, exploit weaknesses, and seize the initiative. Even when defending, tanks were expected to conduct rapid counterattacks rather than remain stationary. Japanese tactical manuals stressed that the success depended on maintaining the initiative through aggressive action, rapid decision-making, and coordinated maneuver. This emphasis reflected a broader characteristic of Japanese military culture, which prized offensive sprint and decisive action. Commanders were encouraged to attack enemy flanks, exploit confusion, and maintain pressure regardless of losses. Although Japanese tanks are often associated with infantry support, Japanese doctrine also envisioned the use of large armored formations. Japanese tactical writings referred to concentrated tank forces as a mobile mass. In this concept, tanks would be gathered into powerful formations and committed at decisive moments where the outcome of an entire campaign might hang in the balance. Japanese planners believed that tanks could never be wasted in piecemeal actions or attritional warfare. Instead, they were to be concentrated and used to strike weak points in enemy lines and with overwhelming force and surprise. Japanese doctrine emphasized that armor should only be committed in such a manner when terrain was favorable. Military studies suggested that attacks against lightly defended positions required at least 30 to 40 tanks, while heavily defended positions might require 60 to 100 tanks. Commanders were taught that the destruction of an entire armored force could be justified if it achieves a decisive strategic victory. And despite these ambitions, the most common role for Japanese tanks was infantry support. Japanese commanders believed that tanks and infantry should operate as a closely integrated team. Tanks would eliminate obstacles, suppress machine gun nests, attack strongpoints, and neutralize anti-tank positions while infantry advanced behind them. If resistance proved too strong, tanks could shift to the flank and attack to open a path for the infantry. This philosophy also influenced Japanese tank design. Japanese tanks were generally lighter and less heavily armored than many of their Western counterparts because planners expected infantry to help protect tanks from enemy anti-tank weapons. Rather than relying solely on armor protection, Japanese doctrine assumed close cooperation between different arms of the military. Two methods of cooperation were commonly used. Tanks could either be attached directly to the infantry unit and respond to their requests for support, or they would be assigned specific objectives while remaining under centralized tank command. In either case, maintaining close coordination between tanks and infantry was considered essential for success. One of the most defining features of Japanese armored doctrine was the belief that surprise was the essence of tank warfare. Japanese tactical writings argued that tanks should attack suddenly and with concentrated power before they could react. As anti-tank weapons became more effective during the war, surprise became even more important. Commanders were taught to identify weak points, attack flanks, and rear areas to then exploit confusion wherever possible. This focus on surprise aligned perfectly with the broader Japanese operational doctrine, which frequently emphasized infiltration, encirclement, and attacks against rear areas, Tanks were viewed as ideal tools for these types of operations because of their mobility and ability to strike deep behind enemy lines. Japanese tank doctrine also included concepts of resembling deep operations. Large armored formations were expected to cut communications, attack headquarters, disrupt logistics, and strike artillery positions far behind enemy lines. Specialized long range raids were designed to send tank regiments deep into enemy territory, supported by reconnaissance elements, engineers, artillery, and motorized infantry. Japanese planners viewed pursuit operations as one of the greatest opportunities for tanks. Once an enemy began retreating, armored units were expected to pursue relentlessly and directly toward their objectives, regardless of losses. Doctrine emphasized audacity and speed, arguing that even a single surviving tank could justify the mission if it has achieved the intended objective. Contrary to popular belief, Japanese doctrine did not ignore tank versus tank warfare. While planners believed their tanks would primarily support offensive operations against infantry and fortified positions, they also recognized that engagements with enemy armor would be unavoidable. Japanese commanders were instructed to remain ready for armored combat at all times. They emphasized rapid decision making, maintaining the initiative, and attacking enemy flanks and rear areas. Concentrating fire on command tanks and leading vehicles were considered particularly important. However, Japanese doctrine still viewed tanks as secondary to the larger mission of supporting infantry and exploiting operational opportunities. This contrasted sharply with German doctrine, which increasingly focused on armored formations fighting other armored formations. The philosophy itself was not necessarily flawed, but Japan's strategic situation limited its effectiveness. After 1941, industrial priorities shifted towards naval and air production, reducing resources available for tank development. As a result, many Japanese units continued using tank designs that had been created a decade earlier, while facing increasingly advanced American and Soviet armor. Although Japan developed more capable tanks later in the war, such as the Type 3 Chinook, most were reserved for the defense of the home islands and never saw combat. The Pacific battlefield also reduced opportunities for large armored operations. Dense jungles, mountains, and island terrain often forced tanks into infantry support roles where their limitations became more apparent. The doctrine of the mobile mass rarely had the opportunity to be fully tested on a scale envisioned by the Japanese planners. In the end, Japanese tank philosophy was built around three central ideas: aggressive offense, close cooperation with infantry, and concentration of armor at decisive moments. While Japanese tanks are often remembered as technologically inferior to Allied designs, their doctrine was more sophisticated than many assume. Japanese commanders understood the value of mobility, surprise, concentration, and combined arms warfare. Their tanks were not intended to fight alone, but as a part of a coordinated system involving infantry, artillery, engineers, and aircraft. Ultimately, Japanese armor doctrine reflected the strategic realities and military culture of Imperial Japan. It has often sought victories through aggressive maneuver and coordinated attacks, even if the industrial limitations of the Japanese war effort prevented that vision from being fully realized. The result is a fascinating example of how military doctrine is shaped not only by technology, but also by geography, resources,